This is Groundeffected. My name is Brent, and welcome to part 2 of making a miniature version of me, but with ginger hair. And in today's video, this is a follow-up from the previous video I made where I had painted Bruenor's head. And in this video, I'm going to paint his body and I'm going to put the two together and we have a complete model. Of course, if you want to support the channel, make sure to leave a like and a comment in the little box below where YouTube allows you to leave some comments. While you're down there, you may as well click subscribe, because if you do that, I will then have one more new subscriber. Unfortunately, this model cannot be bought. This is a private commission. The person who commissioned this model is the only person who has the files for this model, and you cannot buy this model as of yet. And let's not talk too much because this is a long video, so let's just jump straight into the painting. On this piece, there was definitely some stuff I needed to fill in with gaps. In this small clip, you can see me painting over those gaps just to make sure that they are closed and I can see if there's any imperfections by putting a paint over the top of it. Once I've got the model together and I've covered all the cracks and holes that needed to be covered, I'm going to start working on some of the fit. There is a couple of fit issues on this model, nothing too major, but I just needed to fill in some very small gaps, and for this I use green stuff. In this case, green stuff is a little bit more moldable and it sticks a lot better to the model. The reason I use green stuff is because it sticks to the model a lot better than milliput would, and it definitely helps to be able to sculpt it. It is not as easily sandable, but you can definitely use it to cover in gaps inside of the model. Whilst I was sanding the base, I found a little friend. He always sits outside the house. This is one of our pet foxes, and they pretty much just chill there all the time. I started working on the rest of the model. This is now the base coat for the pants. I'm going to use a dark brown at first to give it a base color. I do leave some of the black below that in the shadowed areas just to create a bit of depth. I take lighter browns and I mix them together to create a highlight on the high spots, or essentially where the light would hit the model. I then use a dark brown wash and I'll run that into the seams of the pants. This is just going to help create a little bit more visual interest and also to be able to make it look like the seams are seamy. Using Cygor brown, I'm going to use this color to paint the boots, and I'm just going to give this a solid base color. This is just to get a base coat down so that they're ready for the next step later. I then used a mixture of a couple of colors to create the next colors that I needed on this boot, and essentially I just needed to paint the heel and the toe. It's kind of a warm brown kind of color, so I used a bit of yellow to lighten up the brown, as well as a little bit of that orangey brown just to give it a bit more warmth to it. And I painted then in the heels. I also used Cygor brown to base coat the inside of the shield, and I used a lighter brown to give it a shade, or essentially a gradient from one side to the other. And then I began putting in all the detail for the wood grain that I'm going to paint on this shield. I used this wash to create a little bit more depth between the wood grain. I ended up coming back in and out with washes and a paintbrush and just going over all the grain essentially bit by bit just to create a bit more depth in it. Once I had got the grain to a point that I was happy with, I then base coated the center of the shield using Cygor brown. I also used dark silver to go around the edges of the outside on the back side of the shield. And while I was around that area, I went in and tightened up and tidied up all the edges of the raised pieces and gave that little back piece a second layer. I used the same dark silver that was out to paint a base coat over the emblem or symbol thingy that is on the boot of this dude. Also, while that paint was out, I gave a good solid base coat to his arm shield or arm protector, and once that had dried, I took a shining silver from Army Painter and I dry brushed that over all the ridges and raised edges on this shield piece. I then took Nuln oil, and in this case there was two versions of Nuln oil. There used to be a matte version and a gloss version. In the future you will not get this gloss version anymore, but I used the gloss version of Nuln oil to give it a solid base coat and help fill in some of the cracks and details. I then took brass mixed with rich gold and I made this goldish color that I used to then trim the entire trimming on the entire model. Pretty much kept this on my wet palette, and every time it dried out I just reinstated it with a little bit of water, and in worst case I used a bit of airbrush medium to bring some life back into that paint once it had dried out. I do find I mix quite a lot of this, especially when I'm doing trimming. I don't want to run out of a color and then have to mix it again. That's probably just me being lazy, but it does help to keep a large amount of it on the wet palette. That way it's easy to just reinstate it again once it does dry up a little bit. And of course, if you're using a wet palette, it will help to keep it a little bit longer than usual. But if you do find it's drying out, a little bit of water, and if you're finding that it is drying a little bit too fast, you can also use the airbrush medium, which doesn't evaporate as quickly as water. I used that same gold mix that I had made to trim the boots as well. And then I went to paint the base coats on the helmet. The helmet was essentially just the dark silver solid flat base coat, and then I started to paint the horns that are attached to the helmet. One of them is broken and the other is a full horn, but in order to get them to look how I want them to look, I need to give them a good solid base coat, and I'm going to start out with a slightly darker parchmenty kind of color. Essentially, I just want to have a good base coat for them before I start putting on the whites. It is always going to take a couple of layers, but usually if you use a much lighter color, it will take even more layers. That's why I start out with the darker color. I used bleach bone to then paint in the lighter whites of this horn section. Essentially, I do need to create some kind of gradient between the dark and the light, and I do this by just brushing my brush with a little bit of water and mixing it into each different color as I go. I also used my airbrush without any paint in it just to dry it up to make sure that it was properly dried before I started on the next steps. In the next steps, I'm going to take a little bit of black and I'm going to spray that just onto the tip. I used a very watered down version of this paint. You don't want to do this as a solid thick paint because it will just make it look way too dark. I then dry brushed some of that white over the top of everything to just bring out some of the ridges. And in order to give a little bit of depth to the helmet, I'm going to use the same gloss Nuln Oil, and I'm going to spray this again from mostly the shadows, but I am going to try to get this all over the helmet. I did mask off the horns just so that I didn't get any paint on them. Using that gold mix that I had made earlier, I used that to trim the helmet. Being very careful not to get any of this paint onto any of the other parts of the helmet, because at this point I don't want to go back and redo any of the work that I had previously done. I also made sure to get the underside of the helmet just so that when it's on the head it doesn't look like a little bit awkward without having the gold in there. I then painted a red into the trimming that's across the front section of the helmet and moved on to painting the rest of the model. I used skeleton bone to paint the arms. Essentially this is just his shirt or his undershirt basically. Working on the shield, I'm going to go back with the same browns that I used in other places on the model. This is to tie everything together, and I'm going to spray just the little wooden sections that are in the front, and I'm going to use a wash to create a little bit more depth into the grooves that are on them. Once that had all fully dried, I then used a really bright silver and I painted all the details that are adorning the rest of the shield. Essentially, I needed to make sure that I filled and covered all the gaps, making sure that everything was solidly painted as a solid base coat. I then sprayed some of this wash over the top of everything. This is again just to tie in all the metallic pieces on the model. I need to make sure that I use the same process between all the metal pieces so that they look like they were all done at the same time. I went back in and I picked out some details with that bright silver, mainly just some of the raised ridges that were part of the patterns on the shield. Carefully picking out these parts is just going to mean that there is a bit more visual interest in the shield, helping your eye to have a lot more to see rather than just looking at a flat silver area. It does help to create a little bit of depth by using multiple layers of bright and dark silver so that it doesn't just look too flat. I also used a panel line wash from Tamiya and I put that into a lot of the recesses around the model. This meant that once this is dried, I can use a little bit of thinners and come back and wipe some of that off. This just gives it a little bit more grubbier look than the rest of the armor, especially since it's his shield. I felt like this is the kind of thing he would be using a lot more than his arm to protect himself, so there would be a little bit more grub and marks on the shield. And that was the shield done. I then moved on to painting his hands. I used satin black as the base coat, and I highlighted that with this color called rubber and tires, which I'm pretty sure I've never seen a tire or any rubber this color in my life, but it's okay. We'll just accept that the color doesn't make any sense, and we move on to painting the armor. On the armor, I used dark silver again. Imagine that. I used the same color for all the armor because I didn't want anything to look weird. I painted the straps and I gave them a good base coat before I went back in, and I dry brushed a little bit of a brighter color over the top just to create a bit more depth and visual interest on the straps. Once I had painted the straps on both the arm, on both sides of the body, I then went back in and I used that bright silver again just to paint the buckles. I then base coated his skin tones on his fingers. I did it this way just because it was going to be so much easier to just block these out rather than to try and mask them off, because there is a lot of gaps in between them. Whilst that base coat was drying, I worked on adding the highlights to the little rivets that hold his shield in place with his straps. I just used dark silver for this and it ended up coming out pretty great. Then it was time to work on building up those skin tones, so I started using the exact same skin tones that I used when I airbrushed his face, but this time I watered them down quite a lot and I paint them just in the areas where I feel like the light would be hitting them. Because I used quite a watered down version of this paint, it blends a lot better with the other sections of paint, making sure to leave some of the dark areas behind the fingers just so that you can see the actual depth between the top highlight color and the dark areas at the back. And then I went to work on more trimming on the other shield on his other arm. There is a shield that covers his forearm and I had to put the trim on that, which I will cut out most of this because of course trimming is not the most funnest of things to watch. Like I said, I had to reinstate this gold probably many times while I was working, and once I had got that painted, I gave that again another shade with the Nuln Oil, the gloss version, pretty much coming from just the shadowed areas. Whilst all that was drying, I went on to work on the axe. The axe got the same treatment as everything else. I painted a solid coat of dark silver over the top of it, allowed that to dry, and unfortunately I was having issues with my computer at this time. I think any of the people in my Patreon will remember I was having major issues, so we kind of missed out on a lot of stuff. I missed out on painting the base, I missed out on painting the edges of the axe, I missed out on loads of things. So unfortunately, this is just how it is. There's not much I can do about that. This is the only footage that I have left. This is one of the mushrooms that was on the base. Luckily I managed to save one of them just so that I could paint it for you guys to see. I painted it with a grey at first and then I worked my way up with white just to create a highlight in the spots. If you want to see a more in-depth video about how I painted his face, I did an entire video a couple of weeks back, so if you want to see that, just make sure to look through my playlist. You'll be able to find it pretty easily. I'll leave you with the visuals for now. You can just imagine the words that I was going to say while I was painting this face. Now this is where I left off from the last video. Once I had painted his face, it was time to get back into everything. Usually I wouldn't work this way around, but I wanted to make sure I got a video out for you guys on that last week when I uploaded that video. So I ended up doing this a little bit weirdly, but it's okay. I'm now back to painting the rest of the body. I used a lot of the same colors as I'm working through. The best thing I can say is not to mix too many colors. If you're thinking in your head that because you're using brown, you need to find 17 different browns, don't do that, because if you do that, you are going to confuse your eye. You're going to mix up way too many colors, and it's not going to look pleasing and look good to your eye at all. After painting the belt one solid color, I then started to work on the trimming, again using shining silver, and then while that was drying, I painted in Resin flesh shade just through my airbrush, just to give it a bit of a shadow from the bottom so that it wasn't too flat. I went back in and I painted the rest of the trimming. Not sure why I did one trim and then the others before and after the wash, but just accept it, that's how it is. I then used a red just to go around the trim edge of the skirt on the dwarf. This was to create a good, bright, vibrant contrast between the burgundy of the main part of the skirt and the trimming of it. Also, the hair or fur thing that goes underneath of it, I used black and I wet blended a little bit of dark grey into the tips of that. And just after that dried, I then dry brushed some of that darker grey at first and worked my way up to a little bit brighter grey, just so that we could catch some of the ridges on the edges of the fur. I then used a black wash, Nuln oil probably, to go back in and airbrush some of the darker shades, just so that the depths had a little bit more depth to them and it wasn't just a completely flat dry brushed area. I find this also helps get rid of some of the chalkiness of dry brushing lighter colors, particularly white based colors. I used that same shining silver and I went back in and I painted all those sharp things that are on his skirt and across his chest as well. Let me tell you, those things are extremely sharp. They hurt the living daylights out of me while I was painting this model. I then added a wash to the little gem trinket thingies that are on his belt. This was just to create a little bit more interest, and I worked then on some of the trimming around the body as well. Hopefully you managed to pick up something in this video that will help you with your future painting of your own 3D prints. And at this part of the video, I do need to say something about my Patreon. It's somewhere in the description below. Make sure to click on that if you would like to support further than watching the next video. The Patreon is the place for you. If you want to be part of a private Discord where nobody will berate you and treat you like an idiot, then the best thing you can do is join that Patreon. And speaking of that Patreon, there is a couple new patrons I have to thank for joining in the last week. Nate, Usman, Sek. Hopefully I said that right. I'm not good at saying these things, but that's okay. Thank you, dude, so much for joining the Patreon. It's because of you guys that I'm able to keep blinding myself with the lights brighter than the sun itself. Now, we are at the part of the video where I do need to say, if there was anything you saw in this video that you did not like, the best thing you can do is to just click dislike and then f*** off. And now I've got to send Mini-Me all the way to America. Good luck, Mini-Me.